Hello everyone and welcome, I am Lelu and today let's see how to make these nice loot drop effects. When you think of a video game with items, chances are it features eye-catching loot drops effects. These effects are crucial for distinguishing valuable loot from the environment, making it easier for players to spot amidst the chaos of the gameplay. Today we will create this complete effect entirely from scratch. It's a very simple effect. I also have some more different variations that I have done for my Patreon's page. In case you are interested, there's the link below. I also wanted to mention that I'm planning to take this channel into a new level this year with some special content, and also thinking in create a new Discord group and a new online store with all of my effects, since a lot of people has been asking for it. Okay, so without further ado, let's continue with the tutorial. This tutorial will be divided into 3 parts. First, we will start by creating this blinking flare. This will be the focal point of our effect, making it instantly noticeable. Then, we will sprinkle in some small particles to add a touch of magic and movement. Finally, we will add trails that warp around the item, and this will give it a legendary aura, making our loot drop stand out. Okay, so here we are in Godot. I have just created an empty project, and let's start this effect creating just a simple plane. So let's go over here, click this plus icon, and look for a mesh instance 3D. And let's name this aura glow effect. And for this effect we will need a plane, so let's go to the mesh and select a new quad mesh. Maybe this is too small, so let's change the size. I'm going to set a size of 3 meters by 5 meters. Excellent. So the idea now is to convert this simple plane into a nice glowing aura using a shader, a very simple shader. So let's do that. Let's go to geometry and create a new shader material, new shader, and for this tutorial we are going to use the visual shader, and let's name this, for example, shader blinking aura. Cool. So now we can see we have here the blinking aura shader. Let's open this by double clicking. And now we have this graph editor here where we can start creating the shader. But first I want to do some changes to these shaders. So let's go to flags and enable unshaded and shadows disabled, because I don't want this plane to interact with the lightning and shadows. Okay, so this will be a very simple shader. We will need a texture and a color for this shader. So let's go ahead and right click and create a texture to the parameter, and I will use this texture to control the transparency. So let's name this transparency texture. Set it to color, and in order to use this we need to pick the texture 2D. Okay. And for this tutorial I will use a black and white texture to control the transparency. So I don't need to use all the colors of these textures. I only need to use one channel, for example the red channel, to control the alpha transparency. Cool. And we also need a color, so let's right click and create a color parameter. Let's name it main color. And there we go. Okay, it looks weird because we need to configure the material of this aura glow effect. So let's go to the mesh and let's go to the material. So here we can see this shader parameters option, and we can set a color and the transparency texture. I have already created some textures over here so I can play with and see if I can get a very interesting result. I will leave the links in the description in case you want to download and use these textures so you can use them. So now let's import this into Godot. And let's see, for example, I will use this Aura 7 texture. Okay, this is interesting. Let's set a color, and this will be a legendary item, so I want this to be a blue special color, like so. Maybe this is too weak. I want this blue to be more bright, more intense. So let's manually increase these values here to get something more intense. I will set the color to be a raw color with a value of 0.3, 1, and 3. Okay, this is looking nice, but it is quite boring. I mean, it feels too static. I want this to be more dynamic. So in order to do that, I want this effect to glow, to have like a blinking effect. And to do that, let's modify the shader a little bit. I am going to make this blink over the time. So we will need to go ahead and create a time node. And this time is always counting. It's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and it never stops. But I want this to go between a value between 0 and 1, 0 and 1. So in order to do that, we will need to use some tricks. First, I will use a cosine function. If you click in this icon over here, you can see the result. But this function makes this effect going between -1 and 1. But I want this to go between 0 and 1. So in order to do that, I am going to use a remap node. So this effect goes initially between -1 and 1, and I want it to go between 0 and 1. So we get this interesting result. Maybe I don't want this to disappear, to go to 0. So let's set a range between 0.3 and 1. So it doesn't go completely to black. Right? But you know what? Maybe this is too slow. It feels too slow to me. So I think I am going to multiply this time with a value of 8. So now the time goes 8 times faster. Okay, now let's multiply this blinking result with the transparency texture. Okay, this is much better. And in order to keep everything organized, I am going to create a frame. So I can put this blinking part into this frame and name it blinking part. You can also set a color if you want, just to keep everything organized. Great. I think before continue, we can go ahead and try to add some weapons over here and see how it looks with this effect. So let's do that. I have some weapons over here. Let's pick one of these. Maybe we can move the aura effect a little bit over here. And the reason why I am doing this right now is because I wanted to show you a little problem. As you can see, the effect looks too flat. It's only visible in one side, but don't worry, we will fix this in a moment. Okay, so now let's go ahead and fix this awful flat looking artifact. And in order to do that, I am going to use a special trick. I am going to make this plane to rotate in the direction of the camera. And this is very easy to do. We can go to the shader editor and let's go to the vertex section of the shader. And here I can go ahead and create a get billboard matrix. And right now, as you can see, this plane is always looking at the camera. But this is not good because this effect is too long. So I am going to set this to Y billboard. And by doing this, now the plane always rotates in the direction of the camera, but only rotates on the Y axis. So now, as you can see, the loot effect is visible from any angle. There's one more thing I would like to add. As you can see, if we rotate this too much, we can see how the plane intercepts with the floor and with the item, making this ugly hard edge. And I don't like this. Maybe nobody cares if this is a phone video game because the screen is too small, so nobody noticed this artifact. But for a computer video game or a console video game, I think this looks quite awful and cheap. So let's fix this. Let's go back to the fragment part of the shader. And I am going to use a very special node. I am going to right click and create a proximity fade node. And I will multiply my final result with the proximity fade special node. So now, as you can see, we don't see the hard edges anymore. You can also control how much the edges are fading from the interception. For example, let's put a value of 0.5. So I think this is quite better. Okay, and just in case you want to modify this value, or you want to modify, for example, this value over here, you can always go ahead and create a float parameter and give it a name. For example, let's name this blinking speed. Set a default value of 8. So by creating these parameters, we can close the shader editor. And now we can manually go ahead and here in the material, we can modify that parameter. For example, here we can modify the blinking speed to 20. Okay, this is too crazy. Let's go back to 8. And yeah, that's it for the aura effect. Okay, the aura glowing effect is done. Now let's add some small particles so the players can easily identify this is a legendary weapon effect. Great. So for the small particles, I want to go ahead and create a GPU particle system. Let's name this small particles. And I will move this over here. So I want to focus on the particles only for now. And in order for these particles to work, we first need to create a particle process material. And we also need to give it a mesh. In this case, this will use a quad mesh. So now, as you can see, we have a lot of particle planes falling down, and this is because of the gravity. So let's go to the particle process material in accelerations and set the gravity to 0. Instead of falling down, I want these particles to go up. So I will go to spawn, velocity, and give it a velocity in the y-axis with a random value between 0.4 and 0.8. Also, I want to set the spread to 5. Cool. Now let's go to position. And I want these particles to spawn into a ring position. And we cannot see the ring because I have hidden this View Gizmos option. Let's enable this. Okay. Set the emission ring axis to 0, 1, 0. Let's set an emission radius with a value between 0.3 and 0.2. Okay. But these particles are too big. So let's go to display and set a random scale between 0.05 and 0.1. Okay, this is looking better. I also want these particles to go small over the time. So let's create a new curve over here. So the particles start big and then reduce its size like so. Okay, the movement is looking nice. Now let's add a nice texture. Let's create a standard material. Let's enable transparency. Set the shading mode to unshaded. And let's go to albedo and let's assign a texture. I will use this transparent spot 5 texture. Now let's go to billboard and enable particle billboard. So now the particles are visible in all directions. You can set a color directly here in the material, but I want to do that in the particle system. So let's go to vertex color and enable these two options. So now if I go to the particle system, to color curves, I can assign a color here in the particles. And I want to set a very strong color with a raw value of 0.4, 0.8, and 2. Also, let's do some changes to the particles. I want to set the amount to 10 particles with a lifetime of 3 seconds and the FPS to 60 FPS. Let's go to spawn. Let's go to angle. And let's set a random angle between minus 180 and 180. Okay, the small particles are finished. Let's move it back to the sword and see how it looks. Maybe we can increase the radius a little bit, but I think this is pretty good. Let's disable the gizmos. Excellent, the small particles are done. We could end this effect here, but since this effect will be used in a legendary loot, I think it deserves some more details. Let's make this effect more valuable by adding some nice trails to it. As for the trails, the process will be very similar as we did for the small particles. So once again, let's go ahead and create a GPU particle system. Let's name this trails. And I will move this over here so I don't get distracted by the sword, just for now. And now let's go ahead and create a particle process material. And we also need to assign a mesh for these particles. For now, I am going to use a cube, a very small cube with a size of 0.1. Just for now, I am going to convert this into some nice trails later on, but I want to start figuring out the movement and the velocity first. Make sense? Okay, so let's go to the particle process material, and I will go to accelerations and disable gravity. Now I will go to spawn, and I want these cubes or these trails to spawn into a ring position. And in order to see the ring, we need to activate view gizmos. Okay, I want this ring to be facing upwards, so let's set the emission ring axis to 0, 1, 0, and let's set a height of 0.2, a random radius between 0.6 and 0.4. Maybe these are too much cubes, so I will set the amount to 4. Now I want to set a velocity with a direction in the y-axis and in a range between 0.2 and 0.8. Also, let's set the speed to 0. I only want these cubes to go up. Okay, but I want these particles to spin around the cylinder. So let's go to animated velocity and let's give it some orbit velocity with a random value between 0.6 and 1.3. And as you can see, nothing happens. This is because we need to create a velocity curve first. So let's create a curve XYZ. And now you can see how it's spin in some crazy directions. But we only want these particles to orbit towards the y-axis. So let's go to the x value and let's set this to 0 in the x-axis. And let's do the same for the z-axis. Let's set this to 0. Let's do one more thing. Let's go to particle flags and enable align Y. So now the particles are facing in the direction of the movement. Great, so the movement is looking nice. I like it. So now let's go ahead and convert these boring cubes into some nice particle trails. In order to do that, we need to set up some stuff over here into the particle system. But first, let's go to the mesh, to the draw passes, and let's remove this cube and let's choose a reborn trail mesh. And I want to configure this. Let's set the shape to flat. Let's set a size of 0.08 and a section segments of 4. Okay, as you can see, it looks weird because we still need to configure some other stuff in the particle system. So let's go to trails, enable trails, and set a lifetime of 0.7. And we need to configure one more thing in order for this to work. So we need to configure a material. So let's create a standard material. And let's go down to transform and enable these use particle trails. Cool. Let's configure this material. I want this material to be transparent and set the cool mode to be disabled so we can see both sides of the planes. Also, let's set the shading mode to be unshaded. Let's go to vertex color and enable this option so we can configure the color in the particle system. And we also need to assign a texture for these trails. This time I will use the same texture we use for the small particles. Let's use this transparent spot 5 texture. Great. Let's go up to the particle system and assign a color maybe a raw color with a value of 0.6, 0.8, and 1.5. Excellent. I also want these particles to disappear over the time. So let's create a new alpha curve. And I want these particles to start transparent and then go full opaque and then go transparent again at the end. These particles disappear too fast. So I think I am going to set a lifetime of 3 seconds and set the FPS to 60. Okay, I think this is looking pretty nice. Let's actually put this into the sword effect so we can see how it looks. Let's hide these shapes so we don't get distracted by these gizmos. Okay, so that's basically it. Maybe in order to keep everything organized, we can also go ahead and create a node 3D. And let's name this VFX loot drop legendary. And we can put all these particles into this VFX. And also let's save this, so we can use it later for any kind of item. That's basically it. Feel free to make different variations using different textures and colors, but be careful to not overload this effect with too many particles, especially if your video game is a massive multiplayer with a lot of items popping out. Usually the best approach is to keep a common loot simple, as it spawns more frequently throughout the gameplay, and add more details to the most epic legendary loot effects. So that's it for this tutorial, guys. Remember, all these effects are available on my Patreon's page and many other effects as well. Also, I want to say a big thank you to all of my patrons, and a special thank you goes to my top tier patrons of this month: Jan Mikulaszek, Android 468, Wonderjan, Stefan, Nike Tech. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I will see you in the next video.